Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us. And it's an honor to be here today. The Abraham Accords. Well, the signing of the Abraham Accords in 2020, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab and Muslim countries, shattered a decades-old political deadlock and reimagined what peace in the Middle East could look like. 5 years later, we have seen war, shifting alliances, and renewed regional uncertainty. But the Accords have proven resilient. The question is what comes next. Will the Accords expand to include other regional powers, or will another deadlock emerge? With us this afternoon are two experts on this issue. First, Shama Mishtali is a Moroccan-born artist, entrepreneur, and policy advisor, pioneering the bottom-up movement of the Abraham Accords. As co-founder and executive director of the Emma Lazarus Institute, she leads initiatives that turn the Accords from a diplomatic framework into a living ecosystem. Born to a Muslim-Jewish family in Casablanca, she convened the first Abraham Accords De-Radicalization Summit and co-produced cross-regional art projects, including Maktub, the first Emirati-Israeli exhibition. Professor Amichai Magen is the founding director of the Koum Israel Studies program at Stanford University and a leading scholar on democracy, rule of law, and Israeli politics. He previously headed the MA program in diplomacy and conflict studies at Reichman University in Israel. Shalom, Chaverim, and thank you for being here with us.
Shalom, Tamar. Thanks for having us.
Shalom, thank you.
So let's start with the power of imagination, because one of the most meaningful things the Abraham Accords did was to expound our regional imagination. I mean, after years of political stagnation, when the part of our brain that's responsible for creativity and vision, it just seemed totally frozen, suddenly we could imagine a different role of Israel in the region. And I think the last time that happened was in the 1990s, when we all dreamed of a new Middle East, as Shimon Peres put it. Then came years of disappointment and fear of hoping again, but now it feels like the regional imagination is coming back to life, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about that aspect. Shama, would you like to start?
So it's truly in line with, I think, what some previous speakers spoke about when they talk about holding that Jewish hope amidst really difficult contexts and difficult circumstances. I think that one thing that I really try to push across environments, whether it's in the Middle East or here, is that the Abraham Accords not only gave us a new framework for de-radicalization and for moving the region towards a future of cooperation and regional integration and really kind of moving beyond some of the stifling barriers that have kept the region dysfunctional and as a result kept the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really dysfunctional and kind of at a dead end. They've also given us a new framework for basically what I call new belonging. And what I mean by that is for Israelis who have been growing up in an environment of survival in the Middle East, following this military strategy mostly of we are the civilizational outpost in the Middle East. We're the villa in the jungle that Ehud Barak really pushed for. And I understand where that comes from, but what we ended up having is a big divide, a big rupture and fracture between Israel and Israelis and the larger Middle East. And of course I understand where that comes from. There are real, pragmatic, tangible reasons for why that had to be the strategy, as well as maybe some some gaps in terms of like regional fluency. But I think what the Abraham Accords have done is truly a breakthrough, because they've signaled to Israelis for the first time that they might actually have some partners in the region who are willing to not just moderate their own societies and promote, Jewish history and implement educational systems that move away from sort of this legacy, institutionalized Islamist anti-Semitism. But they say, okay, well, we also want to look at how we can transform this entire region and create safety for talent from all over the world, including Jews and Israelis, to leverage our diversity as a point for power, for sort of the next, what I see as the next civilizational chapter in the Middle East.
Professor Magen?
Yeah, so I think we need to understand the Abraham Accord through the prism that, Tamar, you've articulated as a kind of exercise in expanding our geopolitical imagination, and some aspects of that have been achieved. Some of them, I think, have exceeded our expectations. I just came back from a major conference in Europe that included a panel on the 5-year anniversary to the Abraham Accords. And one of the things that emerged is that despite the best efforts of Iran, the best efforts of Qatar, the best efforts of Turkey to undermine the Abraham Accords, they've proven remarkably resilient. And I think that's really amazing. At the time when United wasn't flying to Ben Gurion International Airport, Dubai Airlines was. And no Bahraini or UAE or Moroccan embassies were shut down. There were no kind of allegations against Israel that came from these countries that were not articulated by what we used to consider some of our best friends, the Canadians, the Australians, and others. So it's proven to be a remarkable success in this regard. But the job is not complete yet. So it's a sort of yes, we've expanded our political imagination. Yes, we've made progress. I think what the Abraham Accords did most fundamentally was to take us away from a Middle East that for many decades we tended to assume was defined by a narrative of Arabs against Jews. That's no longer the dominant narrative of the Middle East. The dominant narrative of the Middle East is moderates, pragmatists versus radicals. And that's a great shift. We haven't yet defeated the radicals. We still have tremendous challenges. But in the Abraham Accords, we have the promise of a cross-faith, warm peace for the very first time, because we had formal peace with Egypt, formal peace with the Jordanians, but it was never the kind of warm people-to-people peace that we have with the Emiratis, with Bahrainis, and of course Morocco, in a very deep sense, because I think Jews have always represented an integral part of Moroccan society. So my message would be, yes, a breakthrough, yes, more resilience than we perhaps could have expected, and we've just undergone the most amazing stress test to the Abraham Accords, the last 2 years and the multi-front war, but the job is not done yet. And if I may add just one more sentence on this, Tamar, we tend to think about the Abraham Accords as fundamentally a foreign policy issue. It is not. It is not. Peace between Israel and its neighbors is fundamentally based on Arab perception that Israel is a powerful and competent and cohesive state, which means that when we think about maintaining the Abraham Accord and expanding the Abraham Accords, the first thing we have to do is to focus internally on Israeli society and make sure that we recover, that we restore the social contract among Israelis, and we once again project to the region that we are a powerful and competent and united country. Because ultimately, the Arabs have not become Zionists. They will make peace with Israel and they will maintain peace with Israel if they respect us and if they see value in this relationship. So when we talk about the Abraham Accords, yes, it has a foreign policy dimension, but it has a very, very powerful internal dimension as well.
Healing is important for Israeli society, and here you just added another aspect to that. And you said the job is not done yet. Is Saudi Arabia the next in line? We know that President Trump is deeply dedicated to expand the Abraham Accords, or as he said in the Israeli Knesset, the Avraham Accords. He likes the Hebrew version of it. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia was very clear that until Israel will be willing to talk about a two-state solution and going ahead with that, we won't see real normalization. So what are the chances as you see it?
If I may start, I think I really want to place our audience in that context of the Gulf and really take you with me on a journey. And on this issue of Saudi-Israeli normalization, or this potential, I want to tell you a story. In early 2023, I was on a policy trip with a think tank in DC, and we met a lot of sort of movers and shakers and leaders of the Saudi 2030 vision, because the whole trip was really about communicating what Saudi's sort of new priorities and strategy for moderation, for attracting talent, for reaching certain socioeconomic timelines. And part of that was sort of growing the security infrastructure. And inevitably, they have been thinking about, well, how could we cooperate regionally with our natural allies, which include Israel, to ward off the extremists. And I have to contextualize this properly, because before Israelis heard about the Houthis and felt the repercussions from Houthi drone attacks, the Houthis were targeting Saudi girls in their sleep in different parts of Saudi Arabia, and it didn't even make the news in the West or in Israel. And so they've been navigating very similar threats for a long time and trying to come up with certain strategies to really move their society towards stability as well as prosperity. Now, this became really difficult. As we know, Saudi got involved in the war on Yemen to disarm and neutralize the Houthis. There were a lot of circumstances at the time, particularly political circumstances, that have made the American-Saudi relationship really challenged, particularly at the end of the first Trump administration. And as some of you might remember, there was already talk of Saudi-Israeli normalization. Then it was going to be part of a security pact offered by the United States. And towards the end of the first Trump administration, there was a lot of stress on the administration domestically with COVID, because this was early 2020, and Saudi's sort of PR brand, its reputation was really tainted in the media, particularly in the US and particularly in democratic spaces and institutions. So the challenge then was really bilateral, because the Saudis were worried about their reputation and how they're going to be perceived. And this is in a media landscape, an environment that is very biased against Israel, and therefore very biased against the Abraham Accords and any attempt to normalize Israel in the region. And therefore, there's a sort of consolidated, strategic, calculated campaign to minimize and deter all of those normalization efforts, particularly in media and culture. And we can definitely go into more details about that. But why am I telling you all of this? Because Saudi has been trying to pursue normalization with Israel for many years. It started with the Saudi Arab-Israeli Peace Initiative in 2002. Through the Arab Spring, we saw new focus on dismantling extremist organizations, which overnight showed up in really interesting and threatening ways to all of these legacy monarchies. And so they realized, okay, well, we have to have a multi-pronged strategy for de-radicalization. And pushing for normalization, the Abraham Accords, is part of that strategy, and that is what I try to communicate. And it was really disheartening to me while I was trying to convey these differences and these needs to Israelis or Americans, that the conversation really stopped in, well, it's just about deterring the Islamic Republic in Iran. It's just about deterring Islamists in the Muslim Brotherhood.
It's much broader than that.
Absolutely.
I want to follow from there
Yeah.
and to say, okay, but what are the chances, Professor Magen, because as far as we know, the Netanyahu administration isn't in the area of going to negotiations about a two-state solution. And to be honest, the Israeli society isn't there as well. So what are the chances given that that's the position of Israel?
Yeah, so to understand that, I think we first need to understand two things. One is that on October 19th, 2023, Mohammed bin Salman, in coordination with President Trump, with the Biden administration, they were going to announce normalization of relations with Israel. So the Saudis were there on October 6th. Part of the rationale of the October 7th attack was to derail that process of normalization. But MBS, in his mind, was already there, which means that he calculated that this would be something that would be acceptable to Saudi society domestically, and that served the national interest of Saudi Arabia, okay? And I think the way to answer, Tamar, your question is, where are the Saudis now? I think the answer is the fundamental structural interests of Saudi Arabia have not changed. When Israel very convincingly dismantled the Iranian nuclear program, at least for the foreseeable future, there was a concern that I heard in Israel that perhaps that would reduce the incentive for the Saudis to join because this main enemy has disappeared. But Iran is coming back. Hezbollah is coming back. So that piece of the puzzle is still there. Where have things become more difficult for MBS, who's visiting Washington at the invitation of President Trump this coming week? I don't think that's a coincidence. Where things have become more difficult for the Saudis is with Saudi public opinion and with the concern of MBS that normalizing with Israel fully, it might be a step too far. So if you ask me where I think this relationship is going, MBS, like other astute authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, will try to do what we call in Hebrew, lalechet im velargish bli, right? To go with and to not have to pay the cost. So my sense is that the Saudis will commit to a process of normalization, but not to full normalization itself. And if I'm an Israeli strategic planner or an American strategic planner, I say that's fine. I'm gonna take the win, and I'm going to build that into the big Trump peace plan. I'm going to make that an integral component in the implementation of the Trump regional peace agreement. So I would bring the Saudis in. I would get them to commit to a process, and then, Tamar, if you like, we can talk about how do we overcome this dilemma, this Gordian knot, of how do we speak about a future, I'm choosing my words here very carefully, not a Palestinian state. No, I am choosing my words carefully because it's important, because this is going to matter to the Saudis. Israel will not say Palestinian state. I don't think the Saudis need to hear the words Palestinian state. I think what they need to hear is dignity for the Palestinians, self-definition, self-determination, self-governance. Thankfully, the English language and Arabic and Hebrew are flexible enough to come up with all sorts of words that we could use to allow MBS lalechet im velargish bli.
I would like to know how you translate that into Arabic.
If I may add, just on this really important point, they have insisted over and over again on saying we just need an Israeli administration that says we are willing to open a path for conflict transformation, a path towards, Palestinian dignity, in those exact words. And that's really important because it helps them deal with that internal domestic sentiment, as well as grievances, as well as an ecosystem that is already fertile for radicalist recruitment. So that's really important. The other thing is Saudi-Israeli normalization is obviously going to be the crown jewel of all normalizations. And what it does, because the Abraham Accords began a process of de-Arabization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Saudi-Israeli normalization will begin a process of de-Islamization of the conflict. And we need the two, because what we had over this last century is the convergence of pan-Arabism and pan-Islamist ideology to deter Jews and Zionists and Jewish sovereignty. So it's really important that we achieve both and that we push for the non-partisanship of the Abraham Accords, because we need not just the top-down movement of the Abraham Accords and the signing of agreements, but we need the bottom-up, and only grassroots organizations and people who have traditionally been invested in sort of left-wing spaces who understand that grassroots mobilization and what it looks like in practice to lead the way and bridge that gap.
And we will talk a lot about the grassroots movement that we really need. But Sham, I want to stay with you because we're in a very unusual moment in which on one hand, Israel is seen in the region as a powerful military force and in some places even as a respected one, especially after its operations against Hezbollah and Iran. But at the same time, in much of the West, Israel is viewed far more negatively, even facing growing rejection of Zionism itself among progressive circles in the US and Europe. And you've seen firsthand how Israel is perceived in the region. And what have you learned from that experience in the past few months?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the Middle East is different because every country has faced its fair share of this struggle between moderates and extremists, and it's really important to anchor it that way. And because of that, they are not in denial about the need to project strength. And that's when this new, I would say, restored vision of Israel as a military superpower, especially post the blowout from October 7th, is really important. I was having conversations with policymakers right at the wake of October 7th who were concerned about whether the Abraham Accords will survive. And my biggest advice was, let's make sure that Israel is strong, that the Jewish community is strong and protected, and Israel is safe, because again, like Amichai said, that's what makes engagement with Israel more attractive in the region. Now, Israel is still a difficult pill to swallow for the majority of communities across the Middle East and North Africa. I would say if we had to kind of break it down, there is about, a 10 to 15% educated elite, tends to be a bit more secular, definitely very, very moderate and wants more moderation in their societies, that is open to cooperation. And in fact, they value economic cooperation with Israel. In particular, there is a version of sort of philo-Semitism and a version of anti-Semitism, if we may say. I have kind of the best story for this, because when I was in Saudi, someone really senior at a family office for strategic investments said to me, I don't have a problem with Jews. I've worked at Goldman Sachs in New York. And so there is this interesting vision where they think in order to really push their own countries towards what they've seen, and it's important to contextualize this because Saudis and Khalijis, people from the Gulf who have been coming to get educated in the US and in the West have really absorbed American liberal values. And so they're interested, how can we transport and transfer these values to actually transform our countries? But what they're also encountering through the Abraham Accords, and even if Saudis don't have a peace deal, just so you know, I was in Bahrain in 2021, and there were Saudis asking for Israeli visas from the Manama Israeli embassy. And so even then, they were meeting a different kind of Jew, right? The Israeli in Mizrahi, Sephardic, and so sort of also just deeply Eastern Israeli ways of being, and learning that it's not just Goldman Sachs Jews.
Professor Magen, your thoughts about this paradoxical moment we're in?
Yeah, so look, we need to, I think, understand that there is a radical Sunni axis that is seeking to retard and undermine and frustrate the maintenance and definitely the expansion of the Abraham Accords. It's not a coincidence that Erdogan in Turkey yesterday announced that they are indicting 43 Israeli politicians and leaders for war crimes. He did it in response to Kazakhstan announcing that they're going to join the Abraham Accords. So we have this grand contestation between, we used to think about the Middle East as defined, a kind of a struggle between a Shia crescent and a Sunni crescent. The Shia crescent is still there, it is weakened, and we have a little bit of time to put it aside, but not very long. What we have to contend with now is the grand struggle happening within the Sunni world between the radicals, meaning adherents to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, primarily Qatar and Turkey, who will do everything they possibly can to rescue Hamas, to make sure that Hamas continues to govern Gaza, to make sure that Hamas continues to expand its influence in Judea and Samaria, and to frustrate any move, to act as spoilers for the expansion of the Abraham Accords. We need to be smart about this, and we need to understand that this is happening, and we need to minimize the influence of Qatar and Turkey, and to empower those pragmatic, not necessarily liberal, but pragmatic elements in the Middle East who want a vision of peace and prosperity and security for them and their children. Then the question becomes, how do we do it? Tamar, if you want, I have a roadmap for all of us for how we do it.
Hopefully we'll get there, but
Okay.
I want to pause on Qatar because I know that you, Shama, have a lot to add regarding the role of Qatar and the Abraham Accords.
Yeah. So the Qataris have invested in a competing project, really a project that goes against the values and this new framework of integration that the Abraham Accords laid out. And so they've doubled down on Israeli rejectionism, and they've managed to do that and create so many forces across the Middle East as well as in the West, as we are seeing, by pouring billions of dollars into different media institutions and outlets, into particularly democratic institutions, as well as academic institutions. And this is really important because it actually, what they're doing in the West, and they have been doing for the past 20 years in America, is the same playbook of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been tried and succeeded in many cases across the Middle East and North Africa. And they've invested in academia. They've invested in that sort of bottom-up, grassroots, cultural shifting and narrative shifting spaces.
And we're seeing, unfortunately, the fruits of it.
Absolutely. So I guess so that I don't just dwell in the negative, I want to also keep this as positive as we can. What I see as really interesting and optimistic is that is what came out of the Sharm el-Sheikh Peace Summit. And you'll notice that the Saudis were not happy about how President Trump really championed the Qataris in that summit. And that's because they feel that as a nation state that has been really trying to moderate the region, they should be the ones who are applauded, not the Qataris, whom, as many of you know, they were blockaded by Qatar in 2017 as a way for the UAE and Saudi to strong arm them into divesting from the Muslim Brotherhood and from their relationship with the Islamic Republic. Unfortunately, that didn't work, and Qatar at the time really doubled down on their investments in extremist organizations and ideology. But the hope from Sharm el-Sheikh was that President Trump understood that they had invested over a long time in this ideology, so he had to give them certain wins. He had to basically deliver certain wins and guarantees, particularly in how the brand of Qatar is perceived globally and in the West. And I think in doing that, he started to disarm the Qataris, and that's really important for this path towards moderation within Qatar and also in the whole region. So there is some hope. We have to hold them accountable. I try to hold Qatar accountable for October 7th, and I know that's a very minority opinion, but I think that's important because they have been these patrons of extremism, of Sunni extremism in particular. And because if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood and how it was born, it was started by a primary school teacher in Egypt in 1928. So for them, this project to actually radicalize either the East or the West fundamentally goes through education. And we see this in Brooklyn, where I live today, where schools, and whether they're private or public, have had their curricula completely subverted and distorted to cancel out Israel from the map. So this is what we have to count on here.
Okay, now we're looking for pushback, for a roadmap. How do we do it? Because I'll just quote someone I know who, let's say, knows Washington very well. I remember that a year ago I was there, and he just said, you look at everything here, Qatar is buying everything they can. It's not only the media, it's not only the academia, it's PR, it's other spaces as well. So like to shorten, I'm sure, a very long roadmap that you have, what are the main things that can be done to weaken Qatar and its influence?
Asking me? Okay. The short answer is that Qatar is 300,000 people living on a giant bubble of gas, which means that they have a lot of money but no military power. And the Al Thani family, the ruling family of Qatar, fundamentally are interested in one thing above everything else, and that is the survival of the Al Thani regime and the security of Al Thani regime. We wouldn't have had the release of the hostages if it wasn't for the Israeli strike on Doha. This was the most successful, unsuccessful military strike in history because it freaked the Qataris out and they ran to Daddy Donald, save us from this Majnun, this crazy guy Netanyahu, and that's how the deal came together. So we might have a clue there for what to do with the Qataris. Very different from Turkey, by the way. It's a different kind of thing. So it's all about costs and benefits. And if I may expand on this a little bit, Tamar, let me just lay out, this is not a sort of a detailed roadmap, but if we want to think constructively about how do we navigate this space, I think we have to take into account several factors, and if you'll allow me, I'll put them out there very, very briefly. Is that okay? Okay.
Of course.
Thank you. So the first thing Israelis need to understand, time is not on our side. Time is on the side of Hamas, Qatar, and Turkey. Every day that we allow Hamas to stretch out and not to enter the second phase of the implementation of the Trump peace plan, it's an asset for Hamas, it's an asset for Qatar, it's an asset for Turkey, because that gives them time to try to buy influence with the United States, with Europe, etc., to make sure that they rescue Hamas and they entrench themselves in Gaza. This is the dream of Erdogan, to restore the Ottoman Empire by returning Turkish influence, whether it's military influence or civilian influence, into Gaza. Remember, the beginning of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire happened in November 1917 when the Ottomans lost the Battle of Gaza to the British. Erdogan is thinking in neo-Ottoman terms. He wants to restore Turkish influence in Gaza. It will be a catastrophe. We have to prevent that. Okay, how do we do it? One, we say that everything that Israel is doing is part and parcel of implementing the Trump peace plan. It's all part of the Trump peace plan. Even when it isn't, it's all part of the Trump peace plan. 1. 2, we say that there is a shared responsibility of the children of Abraham for the future of the Middle East. The Palestinian problem is not an Israeli problem. It's not an Egyptian problem alone. It is the problem of the region and of the world. And if you want to have peace and prosperity and stability, you have to join the Trump peace plan, because that is the future, and everybody has a role to play in it. 3, big bag of goodies versus big bag of pain, okay? What I mean by that, we need to enlarge the cake of the incentives that we provide Saudi Arabia and every other country in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East, Indonesia, Pakistan, etc. Big bag of goodies. You want F-35s? You come in. You want AI technology? You come in. You want access to Israeli knowledge in water desalination? You have to come in. We're going to create a giant R&D fund, research and development fund. You want to tap into that? You come in. Those are the carrots. And then there are the sticks. If you don't come in and you try to be a spoiler, you're going to start paying a cost. And the job of Israeli diplomacy will be to convince the Trump administration to create the bag of goodies and to create the bag of pain and to give the Qataris a choice. Are you on the right side of history or are you on the wrong side of history? The beauty here is that we have very recent precedents of Gulf states, neighbors of Qatar, who've chosen the right path. The Emiratis, Saudi Arabia, an unbelievable transformation. Saudi Arabia was the most radical, conservative, jihadi exporting country in the world in the 1990s, and it changed. And Qatar can change too. But it will only change if we put before it, v'bacharta b'chaim or b'mavet, bacharta b'chaim. You have to choose the right path to go forward. There are 3 other points on my plan, but we'll maybe leave them to Q&A.
Okay, we sure will. Well, thank God Israel has a lot of goodies to give to whoever wants to make peace with it.
We need more goodies.
Yeah.
More goodies.
But as you mentioned, it all goes through de-radicalization, as Saudi went through. And whenever we try to imagine a better future, it always involves de-radicalization, societies becoming less extreme. And some of the countries that signed the accords have already gone through that process. So, Shama, what can we learn from their experience, and how do you actually de-radicalize a society? And I'm asking that as an Israeli because from, POV Israel, when people look at Gaza and what's happening there, it can feel hopeless, as if extremism will last forever.
Yeah, I think what these moderate countries have really deeply understood is that you will have to have a very determined, strict, anti-Islamist policy and to really execute that policy without asking for permission. And of course, when you're not a democracy, it's a little bit easier than if you were to try to implement the same things here. But I think there's definitely wisdom in terms of how that decisive action was implemented. For example, the UAE leading the bans on Hamas in 2014 and declaring all of the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist organizations down to what is perceived as humanitarian organizations like Islamic Relief, and really not apologizing about cutting the financial lifelines of these extremist organizations that were feeding the conflict and feeding basically Palestinian grievances and the status quo. And that's really important because the Palestinian question has become this bedrock of this foundation, really this bedrock of extremism in the region. So I think it's important to learn from that kind of leadership and to convey those lessons in the West. Now, when it comes to de-radicalization, and this part of the wisdom of why I created and convened the first Abraham Accords De-Radicalization Summit, it is to translate decades of Nazification of the Middle East and North Africa, because unfortunately Nazism didn't stop with 1945 or with Germany and Europe's denazification models. It really moved. It migrated east and was fused with Islamist ideology and created an overall culture of radicalism that incentivizes extremism and that creates environments of belonging for the extremists and pushes away the moderates. And unfortunately, this is what we are seeing here. Because how come, and this is a question for everyone here, how come the only representatives of Islam and Muslims in the Arab world in the West, and particularly in America and in DC and in New York, where I live today, are political Islamist radicals? They are all anti-Zionists. They are all meeting to plan how to annihilate Israelis and destroy the only Jewish state. We have to ask these questions and to counter those efforts by creating environments, spaces, organizations that actually platform a different type of Islam. And that is precisely the gift of the Abraham Accords, is that it allows us to engage with the Middle East differently and to actually have these opportunities of platforming moderation in the West to say, we are not Islamophobic. We just want Muslims who are spiritual, cultural Muslims, but are not political extremists who are invested in the demise and the distortion of democracy from within.
Feel free, yes. Should be applauded. Following on the radicalization of a society, can a society de-radicalize itself in the Palestinian case, or would we need the help of the world? I mean, can we achieve that? Professor Magen.
Okay, so the first thing we should say about this, you hear this a lot. You can't defeat Hamas because Hamas is an idea and you can't defeat an idea. Nonsense. Nonsense. Bad ideas do die, and we can help them die. Slavery was seen as being a natural part and a moral part of the human condition for thousands of years. Eventually, we killed the idea that slavery was normal or to be accepted. Women were seen as chattel in most human societies for millennia. We haven't reached equity and equality yet, but we've made a lot of progress in that regard. The Nazi Party was far less popular in Germany in 1945 than it was in 1939. Okay? So let's first of all get over the idea that we cannot kill terrible ideas. Unfortunately, some good ideas also die, but that's a topic for a separate conversation. Yes, we can. We can stand up to radical Islam. We can expose that radical Islam brings poverty and violence and oppression wherever it spreads, and that we don't have to import the Intifada into our societies and onto our campuses. We don't have to do it. There is a better alternative. There's a better future for the Middle East. And what we need to do is give voice to the struggle that is happening across the Middle East and within the Sunni Arab world itself, and within Palestinian society itself, expose the bad and support the good. And that needs to be done in Israel, that needs to be done in the Palestinian arena, that needs to be done in Morocco, that needs to be done across the Middle East. It also needs to be done here in the United States.
And if I may add just a very quick point, we had a model of Japanese radicalism that is very close to some of these celebrated virtues around extremist societies across the Middle East and North Africa. Kamikaze culture celebrated that sense of martyrdom. And then what Japan did post-World War II is it decided we're going to de-radicalize our society. We're going to move away from these imperial colonial ways of thinking. We're going to really offer our society a better future. And I think that's the hope, is that it has been done before, and the Middle East in 20 years and 40 years could look more like these Asian countries. It could look more like Japan and less like Gaza today.
And Tamar, may I just one more thing? This is central to the future of trying to move forward with the Palestinians. Unless and until we disabuse the Palestinians of the dark fantasy that they can annihilate the Jews, they can annihilate the state of Israel, we will simply not make progress, okay? Sadly, for decades and decades and decades, billions and billions of dollars, euros, yens have gone into perpetuating a Palestinian ethos, both the nationalist side, the Fatah side of the Palestinian political map, certainly Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a Palestinian ethos that is entirely built around the rejection of the existence of the State of Israel and of profound hatred for the Jews. All of our taxpayers' money, including, I say this as an Israeli taxpayers' money, has tolerated books that teach Palestinians that to kill a Jew is the greatest thing that we can do. Israeli taxpayers' money has gone to pay for the families of terrorists who've been sent to jail, and we pay them salaries. It's got to stop. It's got to stop. We're not going to make progress until we de-radicalize Palestinian society. The Saudis understand that. The Emiratis understand that. And here lies a key for convincing the Saudis to move forward with normalization with Israel, because the argument can be made, you, the Saudis, you have transformed your own society. It's much better. You, the Emiratis, you have transformed your own society. How great will it be for Saudi Arabia and for the Emiratis? By the way, they compete with each other. So we should be saying this to both and say, you should come in before the Saudis do it. You should come in before the Emiratis do it, to create some competition there. But they want to legitimize their governance at home, and they want to export their brand of Sunni governance abroad. And so we should be in dialogue with the Saudis and the Emiratis saying, we the Jews cannot de-radicalize the Palestinians, but you can. And it will be great for the Palestinians, and it will be great for Saudi Arabia, and it will be great for the UAE.
And I would like to add another layer to this important discussion, and I'm not drawing any comparison between Palestinians and Israelis in this sense of extremism, because I know it's day and night in that sense. But we should say that, in recent years, we have seen a rise in racist attitudes towards Arabs in Israel. And of course, after October 7th, Israeli society is deeply traumatized. So, it's understandable that we're under trauma, but at the same time, it's crucial for us as a society to push back against any kind of racism. And I really think that the Abraham Accords give us a sense of hope in that regard, because many Israelis feel deeply connected to these agreements. And as the accords continue to trickle down into everyday life, not only between diplomats, but business partnerships and traveling to Dubai and etc., hopefully the more cultural exchange in the future will bring to our own society to heal and to be healthier. And I would like now really to turn to the question, how do you make this important peace agreement into everyday life of Israelis and the other countries that are part of it in our culture? We've seen already, in tourism, etc., but in more spaces that more Israelis and other people will be part of. Shama, you're very invested in that track.
There are so many ways to answer that question. Let me just start by saying that in 2020, when the Abraham Accords were announced, tens of thousands of Israelis started flocking into Dubai and Abu Dhabi, so much that I walked out of my apartment one day in November 2020, and I just started hearing Hebrew everywhere. And it was really insane. It was like a dream come true to be able to see that, to see Israeli and Egyptian girls in fitting rooms in the mall, talking to each other, helping each other out, pick outfits and the right size. And so these human experiences were taking place. I co-produced and co-curated the Maktoub exhibition, which was the first Emirati-Israeli exhibition in Jerusalem, with the blessings of the Ministry of Culture of the UAE. And to do that in Jerusalem, that has been contested by all of these Islamist organizations and pan-Arabist countries for so long, and to walk into this environment where so many diplomats from the Arab world, as well as change makers from both Israel and from the UAE and Bahrain and Jordan, were seeing that future really take shape. And I mean, it was so emotional. Everyone was crying because I think at the root of Israeli society, despite all the trauma, and perhaps because of the trauma, is a longing, a deep longing for that reconciliation and that integration in the fabric of the Middle East organically. And so this is all possible, and I think we have to be really bold and courageous and model this behavior even when it's really hard and challenging. Now, on the issue of extremism, we cannot compare extremism within Israeli society and within Palestinian and larger Arab world, Muslim world societies. It's just not comparable, not in numbers, not in ideology, but I think Israeli as a democracy is navigating similar challenges to all democracies and all liberal environments all over the world, where again, because of specific extremist forces, democracy is being derailed and questioned, and there is less trust with democratic institutions. And so we are seeing a lot of, anti-liberal sentiment that is showing up. And so to isolate Israel the way that Al Jazeera does and focuses on, one settler or one minister, and to blow up those extremist statements or sentiments out of proportion is precisely because they don't want us to perfect democracy. They don't want us to perfect the implementation of these liberal values. And so it's important to contextualize that as part of what the West and democratic countries are facing, and to not treat Israel separately, but rather collaborate, join forces, help Israel deal with that sentiment. And by the way, I think it will happen naturally because the sense of peoplehood within Israel is remarkable. And we saw that after October 7th with Brothers in Arms and the grassroots mobilizing that was so organic. I think it's actually more challenging to see it in countries like the United States, where you don't have that same level of shared belonging. And so it is possible. To go back to the Saudi normalization, they are afraid of normalizing with a government whose two ministers in particular, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, have normalized very extremist rhetoric and sentiment. And of course, because they exist in the Middle East, Al Jazeera has influence. Those Islamist stories and narratives have a lot of influence within their own communities. So they can't sign this agreement with the government the way it looks like today. And that we need to understand as an American Jewish community, as an Israeli community, to move things in the right direction. So a lot of things have to move at the same time.
Professor Magen, how do younger Arabs and Israelis view the Accords compared to their parents' generation? I mean, do you sense a generational difference, whether it's in openness, skepticism, or curiosity?
So 21% of the Israeli population is not Jewish. About 16% are Arab Muslim Israelis. About 4% are Christians. We have Druze, Circassians. It's a very diverse group of minorities, and I, as an Israeli, I love that. I think Israel is profoundly enriched by having this diversity. I love the fact that 40% of Israel's national soccer team are Israeli Arabs. Moroccan food is my favorite food, I have to admit. So, as an Israeli, I see my Arab Israeli compatriots as brothers and sisters. They're part of my society. I want to make sure that continues, and I want to make sure that we have thriving, respected, and and close relations for all Israelis, including Israeli Arabs. And it pains me deeply to see manifestations of racism against Arab Israelis and against Palestinians. So I think that should be our starting point. We're made better, we're a richer, more vibrant society by having fully integrated, active minorities, and that very much includes Arab Israelis.
And isn't it amazing that so many of the ones who criticize Israel aren't even aware to the fact that nearly 20% of Israel are
21%.
non-Jews, 21% are Arab Muslim, Arab Christians, Druze, etc.
Yeah. So to your question, Tamar, what I see in Israeli society is a diverging set of trends. One is very, very positive, the other is more worrisome. What you see, hakarat hatov is an important value in Judaism. So let's start with the good, and we'll end with the good too, but we'll start with the good. Over the last generation in particular, especially in urban areas, we have seen remarkable integration of young Arab Israelis into mainstream Israeli society. Let me give you a figure that I was looking at recently. After the October 2000 riots that existed in Israel, there was a very painful incident where the Israeli police opened fire on Arab demonstrators at the beginning of the Second Intifada, and 35 Arab Israelis were killed or seriously wounded in this. And there was a commission of inquiry that was established to look at the situation of particularly of young Arabs in Israeli society. And you saw that Arabs, and especially Arab Israeli women, were grossly underrepresented in higher education, in public service, etc. So a commission was set up to start to work on this. Israeli civil society rallied. Israeli governments invested resources into this. And today, do you know which demographic group is the largest represented in electrical engineering and computer science at the Technion in Haifa? Arab Israeli women. Arab Israeli women are the largest cohort. That's amazing. And you never hear about that. And it's fantastic. And we need to do much more of that, and especially to take that out of the urban areas and into the Galilee, into the periphery and the Negev. Which brings me to the downside. If you look, for example, at rates of Arab Israeli and especially Bedouin service in the IDF, it's been going down pretty dramatically. And there is a process which is deliberate and which is funded of a kind of Palestinization, particularly of the Bedouin population in the south of Israel. We have a growing problem with organized criminal gangs, Arab Israeli criminal gangs in the Galilee and in the Negev. And there's still a lot of work to be done there. But what we've seen is that when we have a coherent and sensible and determined policy of investment in education and integration into the labor market and so on and so forth, we can achieve remarkable things. So we can do it.
Shama, to draw back to the Abraham Accords, how do the young generation in different Arab countries view the Accords? And what should we be happy or concerned about when we look at the younger generation?
So we have some differences between the pre-October 7th and post-October 7th eras, and the Arab Youth Policy Report detailed that by late 2022, early 2023, sentiment towards Israel was really shifting favorably. It reached almost 50% in places like Morocco, where there is still a lot of room for sort of civic protest, even though it's a monarchy, because it's a constitutional monarchy. But in places like the UAE and Bahrain, it was quite close to 70% or 72%. And unfortunately, after October 7th and the war, this sentiment has shifted also because it's very difficult for people to be constantly sort of meeting these really horrific images from the war and to publicly say that they support Israel. Now, privately, is a very different and I would say nuanced story. And this is where I go back to the differences between, I would say, the elites and sort of the 99%, where much of the elite understands that in order to have economic prosperity, we have to dismantle these terrorist organizations. And also, a lot of people really applaud the Hezbollah attack, Pager attack, for example, which was inconceivable and really showed the region and the moderates in particular in the region that specific point that Amichai brought up, which is that we are not doomed to follow this extremism, that there could be other ways. So I'd say it's more nuanced. Today, unfortunately, post-October 7th, the majority of people, including in kind of what is seen as progressive, more secular spaces across the Middle East and North Africa, are anti-Israel in the way they sort of speak publicly, but behind closed doors, particularly they say, well, we actually really don't have a problem with integration with Jews, with the idea of Israel. We just don't want to see this government that is in place right now. So then I think that's an important shift, and you'll see it mirrored in how the UAE has been sort of managing its own PR crises because of the relationship with Israel. And they're saying, this is giving us an avenue of engagement so we can criticize, we can get our points across, we can help Palestinians, we can develop all of these humanitarian initiatives on the ground, but they never delegitimize Israel in the ways that we were used to. And there's a reflection also in the educational systems. Impact SE, which is an Israeli social innovation organization, looks at these differences and developments, and they've been tracking the educational system in Bahrain, UAE, Saudi, and Morocco, and seeing a lot of positive changes. And the one hopeful thing that I want to leave you with is to change the Arab world's mentality on Israel and vis-a-vis Israel is actually a lot easier in the Muslim world than the Arab world, because a lot of these countries, again, it's centralized leadership, and before the school year starts, their textbooks get printed, and so they have to have approval from various ministries. And so if we want the next generation to be fully de-radicalized, to have access to Jewish and Christian and minority education, there is a much more immediate return on
that you can achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the last question, if you allow yourself to dream for a moment, how do you imagine the region 10 years from now? And what could it look like if the spirit of the Abraham Accords continues to grow? We'd like to start, Professor Magen.
It's very easy. It will look like my hometown in Israel, Kiryat Tivon, which is an idyllic place. But I want to spend the little time that we have left by maybe saying something about what we could do here in order to promote a much more positive vision of the Middle East. And this is something that I'm beginning to think about as the founding director of the Koum Israel Studies program at Stanford. I also want to thank Eli Reinhardt and the Arcadia Foundation for being such great friends of ours and helping us start this program. When I was a graduate student at Stanford, there was nothing about Israel. There was nothing about the Middle East. We've made progress. So there are things that we can do here that I think are really important. Professor Dan Shapiro, Tamar, in conversation with you, I believe, made this really critical point, which is if the alliance between the United States and Israel begins to fray, that will have catastrophic consequences, not just for the United States and Israel, but for the entire region. It will greatly empower all the spoilers, all the people that wish to take us down the path of extremism and state failure and radicalization. And remember, it's not just a regional game, it's a global game. The Russians are watching, the Chinese are watching, okay? This is a global game. So we need to focus on making sure that US-Israeli relations are powerful and that we empower both the US and Israel through innovation and entrepreneurship. We in the Bay Area have a unique vantage point from which to do this. The future, it will be determined by power relations, and power relations are formed by spirit, by values, by spirit, but also by capabilities. We need to make sure that Israel wins the AI war with the United States. We need to make sure that we lead on defense tech and on cyber and all these things, that we can make a real difference here. And I know there are entrepreneurs and investors who are working in the space. Understand that what you are doing is not just a form of economic activity. It has profound geopolitical implications for the whole region. In academia, I'm going to repeat myself, we don't have to import the Intifada onto campuses. There is a better vision, there is a better future. We need to flesh it out, we need to articulate it. We need to bring young Saudis and Emiratis to Stanford and show Stanford students that we get along and that we have much more in common than divides us. I'm somewhat skeptical about people-to-people efforts in the Israeli-Palestinian context right now. I think we still have a lot of work to do. But when it comes to Morocco and to Bahrain and to the UAE and Saudi and Indonesia and Pakistan, it's a long list. There are 57 majority Muslim states in the world. There's much more than we can do. And we in the Bay Area could be a hub for people-to-people connections that will project back into the Middle East, and that's something that we should be working on.
Shama, your dream for 2035, yes.
So very much aligned with that vision, I'm working on a new initiative right now under President Herzog's Voice of the People, where I'm in charge with my team on enhancing Jewish and non-Jewish relations. So we're working to create a regional integration incubator as a first stage in Abu Dhabi, and then to replicate it across Abraham Accords countries. And what that will do is it will incubate social change leaders and entrepreneurs and get them in the same environment to actually think about how to translate this vision for integration into real, tangible initiatives and long-term impactful initiatives. And that's really important because since I explained the challenges with extremist organizations, in the Gulf countries in particular, there is no room to create NGOs, because NGOs have traditionally been used for Islamist activity, recruiting, financing, etc. And so the social innovation that will allow us to change the culture from the ground up has to lean on technology and entrepreneurship and AI. And we need all of those things to scale and to be scalable, particularly because on the other side, we've had billions of dollars poured into boycotts and divestments and rupture and this impossibility of peace or rejectionism across the region. So my hope is that in 10 years, that incubator exists across the Middle East, hopefully, but across the Abraham Accords countries. My hope is that more countries will have not only joined the Abraham Accords, but this is really the foundation of what I think is the future of the Middle East. And I think by then, it will lead to fruits and to real returns. Hopefully, my personal hope is I want to have mobility from Saudi to Israel. I want to hop on a train and
I'm coming with you,
and go from Tel Aviv to Al Ula and actually experience the beautiful, rich, diverse cultures that region has to offer, and that in many ways we see it consolidated in that one tiny sliver of a country called Israel. But I want to see Israel leading with that model and really allowing that possibility to be visible.
Shama and Amichai, thank you for widening even more our regional imagination. Thank you very much to our audience as well.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you, Shama.